Welcome to the channel, everybody. My name is MrHurriicane, and for the last 20 plus years, I've been obsessed with simulation-style sports games and trying to make the things I play more realistic. And what I have today are my XP and progression sliders that I've spent the majority of my time on Madden 24 working on. Now, if all you care about are the settings, here you go. You can take this, enter all those values and settings, and you'll be on your way. But I want to spend this video explaining the set, my process, and everything I did to make this set and what my goals were in doing so. So buckle up, I have no idea how long this is about to take, but I got a lot to say, and I'm excited about this XP and progression slider set because I have been looking for an experience in Madden that really hasn't been possible because there just hasn't been enough tools at our disposal, at least on the console side of things. Maybe on PC with mods you can do a lot more, but that's beyond my capabilities. But this year, there wasn't like a lot new in franchise mode, but they did introduce some things that I knew I'd be able to do a lot with. For instance, we have draft class strength sliders, so now you can tune each position and how the draft class is going to give you those players. But the big thing was they expanded the XP sliders. We've had these ones for a while where you can control progression, but now they gave us the ability to control progression at the age level along with regression at both the position and age level. And that gave me everything I needed to put together this set. I spend a lot of my time inside a franchise, and I do multiple series typically, and so I've gone through a lot of seasons. I've seen a lot here. I'm getting old. And I've noticed a lot of the same trends once you get to a few years into your franchise and further on down the road. There are specific trends that I haven't liked. For instance, running backs. They stay on top of the NFL forever, and you'll be in year 8 watching Nick Chubb lead the league in rushing. Joe Mixon will be right behind him. And I felt like more or less in a lot of my franchises, you see a lot of teams further down the road, they're just older versions of what they started with. And now there are a few superstars along the way that'll pop up and elevate and become some of the best players, but it never felt like it was enough. In certain positions, I really didn't like how they developed. In addition, the way progression works in Madden, basically everybody's got an XP bar, and they all just continuously get better. Now, the older a player is, the more XP they need to upgrade. But it still really didn't create a cycle that I felt was realistic, where players would quickly become, average star, superstar players, and then they'd play out their prime years, regress as they hit 30 and beyond, and then they're replaced by a younger group of players. And I wanted to create a slider set that would allow you to go a few years into the future and see that that cycle is actually playing out. Teams are replacing their 28-year-old running backs. They're playing rookies. And at the same time, I wanted this league to quickly establish who the new stars are. I really don't like going into year 5 of a franchise and really just seeing the same faces everywhere. So the key for me was to get players developing very quickly once they enter the league. And you'll notice that my XP sliders, they look a little low on the position side of things. But when you look at age, that is where the power truly lies. On my card here, I have it said that age sliders are important. This whole thing is important, but the age sliders especially, you cannot just use the position sliders and be done. You've got to use the age. Now, I believe that my set is more realistic than what is default on Madden. It's of course my interpretation of what a realistic XP system is in the limitations that Madden gives us. But the way I look at it, players should be able to reach their peaks or close to their peaks during their rookie contract, sign a big deal if they are star players once those 4 or 5 years are up, And then they should begin to regress as they approach 30, get into their 30s, and then they're eventually replaced. Not everybody's a 10-year starter. You should see average players who stick around for a few years, stars who maybe play 5 to 10. And I wanted to see regression be boosted across the board because this is a young player's game in a lot of cases. Certain players will play into their late 30s, but there's a reason why we point them out. It's not supposed to be normal. The oldest starting running back in the NFL in 2023 is Raheem Mostert, 31. And that's how old I am now. Pretty soon, I'm going to be older than all the starting running backs in the NFL. So the main goal was to allow this class to create stars at any position if they have good ratings, high development, and produce at a high level. The next thing was to make sure that the positions themselves are pretty balanced. Now, I did take note of how many 90 overall and 80 overall players were at every position. I used those as a guide, not necessarily a rule. I like to be in the neighborhood of those numbers, but it wasn't a deal breaker. For instance, at the quarterback position, there are 13 players who are ranked 80 overall or higher. For you to achieve that with sliders, you need either extremely low progression sliders, or you need to set your quarterback draft class strength to weak. And I ran a test with this. The three positions I was most focused on here were quarterback, running back, and cornerback, because I felt there was something off with each one of those spots. But with weak quarterback draft classes, you rarely end up with those high-level prospects that are deserving of number one picks. And I ran some tests, some long, 10-year sims with quarterbacks set to weak, and it was okay. There would be starting quarterbacks from these draft classes, but they would not take over the top spots very often in the league. And I decided that if I couldn't have a perfect setting, because I felt like there were too many good quarterback prospects on normal, not enough on weak, so I'm going to take the universe where you have a few too many. Now, I have some examples here I wanted to share with you. I'm going to start loading them as I talk through a lot of these positions and why they are what they are. These sliders were not built upon just doing 10-year sims and then calculating overalls. I started out by going position by position, year by year, to see how individual players were developing, because at the end of the day, I wanted a player with superstar development who produces good numbers to have a chance to become like a 90+ overall if they string together a few really good seasons. So I ran a lot of tests just looking at a few different players and tweaking settings based on their results, because there really is a twofold deal here when you're looking at Madden classes, or really leagues. And it's that you need the progression sliders to progress players in a way that makes sense, but you also have to keep in mind, what are the draft classes giving you? If the draft classes are constantly giving you high-level quarterback prospects, well, you're going to have a pretty strong quarterback league as you go into your league's future. So do you then just nerf XP so that doesn't happen? That to me was not a good solution. Players who have the development and the stats to be a high overall should get there, regardless of how many players the draft classes are producing. And some positions end up being very strong in terms of their star power, like wide receiver, quarterback, tend to have a lot of superstars, potential generational prospects. But how often do you see those generational centers? Not often. Guard, not often. So let's go through one of my example franchises here. So I've simulated this one to the year 2031. I brought us to the beginning of 2032 just so we don't have a bunch of players as free agents or anything. We can see what this league truly looks like. But I ran a bunch of 10-year sims, and while I'm working on other stuff, I've had this PS5 just running simulations, and I'll look over and see we're 7 years in the future, and I'll stop it and check it out, take some notes on it. The league is not going to look the same every time that you run a simulation here or play a franchise. So let's just take a look. This is one of my example files that I have, and in our league right here, we've got two players who are 99 overalls, Typically, when I get deeper into the future, I see about 5 to 10. I wasn't concerned with getting players 299 or anything, but in general, I'd say it's fairly rare unless they had high development, were drafted high, and produced at a very high level. So here in 2032, best quarterback in the league was actually drafted in the simulation. Here we got Samuel Hughes, an X-Factor quarterback for the Rams, who is a 94 overall. I spent a lot of time simulating and then checking out player profiles to see, all right, how exactly did you get to this overall? And do I feel this is right based on development and your resume, basically? And in this case, Hughes is an MVP, Rookie of the Year, Pro Bowl, high-level quarterback. And he developed to this point, putting up some really big numbers, basically, in this Rams offense. So the best quarterback in our league is 28 years old. And then you see the third best quarterback in the league is 26. Now, I looked a lot at position depth as well. I didn't want to force like a certain number to be 90 overall, a certain number to be 80 overall. It was really about getting developments to make sense. And the league will go where your draft classes take it. So if you end up with a bunch of classes that produce really good tight ends, well, tight end's going to be a strong position group in your franchise. But if those players don't come around, well, we're not going to just raise the XP to boost up these normal and star dev players so that they fill in those 80 overall and above gaps. That's not how it should work. So in this run and in most of my runs, we end up in a situation where the majority of the league has at least an 80 overall quarterback. And again, that's just a spot where I felt like setting the draft class strength to weak produced too few good quarterback prospects. And so what I did is I dropped the QB progression then to 60, where I would still see players with good development and good numbers have a chance to become the best in the league, like we've seen here in this sim. There's a 26-year-old who is the third best quarterback now. And with the regression, you're still seeing guys like Patrick Mahomes and Joe Burrow. And in general, there's a lot of star power in the NFL. And the way Madden's XP system is set up, they're just going to keep getting upgrades throughout your franchise. That's why I've been pretty aggressive with regression so that they don't just stay the best quarterbacks forever. A lot of these guys will stick around because it's hard to regress 99 overall players, but you can see there's some nuance here, like Justin Herbert's down to an 87 at 34 years old, Trevor Lawrence is an 86 at 32. I wanted there to be a good deal of variance and not everything playing out the same way. Let's go to running back on this one. So Bijan Robinson is the best in this league, and he's the best in most of the sims that I do because he's an amazing prospect that comes in one of the highest rookies in the game. But here we're seeing the best running backs in the NFL are not all like 30-year-old players, and now we're like 9 years into the future, so a lot of those players have just retired. But you're seeing the league is not made up of just a bunch of 90-plus overall running backs. The base roster ends up with around like 30 running backs at 80-plus overall, and I think we're pretty close to that here. If we go to 79 overall, 31st in the league. So what does it take for some of these running backs to then become higher overalls? Well, in this case, we got Daniel Matthews, who is truly a 93. A boost is taking him to 95. He's an X Factor. Now, he hasn't produced at the highest level. He's had a 1,100-yard year, an 18-touchdown season, and he ended up coming into the league in the first round. So he probably had a fairly high overall, really high development. This year probably gave him a lot of experience. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that you have to play in the limitations of what Madden allows you to do. And Madden has really messed with the running game a lot, and I've had a big issue with running backs and their development throughout the last few years in Madden. So what you typically see is that under 80 overall, these running backs just cannot produce very well in any offense. They're going to have under 4 yards a carry. They're not going to be the best in a lot of cases. Here we got Brian Chapman, who started off, 3.6, 3.6, eventually got to the point where he's finally getting 4-yard a carry seasons. But it was very rare in past games for running backs to come in and be immediate impact starters. And that's what you see in the NFL. Running back is not a draft and develop position. If you haven't figured it out by your second year, you ain't gonna make it. And so I've wanted Madden to give us the tools so that running backs can come in and make an earlier impact. And that's why you'll notice that running back progression on my set is set to 100. Now, it was lower just a couple days ago because I was experimenting with the running back draft class strength set to strong, which would produce a lot of day one viable running backs that would sometimes be generational, like a Bijan Robinson or Saquon Barkley, or they'd just be a solid like 76 overall. But what I saw is that there would be too many years where you'd have literally 5 or 6 first-round running backs, and I knew people wouldn't really like that. It did have the potential to get a little out of hand, although in my sims it played out fine. I brought it back to normal and raised the XP, and we're now seeing a lot of these players still become stars in their first few years. So you're going to have those star running backs pop up. Here is Austin Rucker, and again, starts off a little slow and then turns it up a little bit here, and he's only like 25 or 26 years old as a second-round pick too. So I love seeing that a lot of these players that are big hits and stars are not just first-round players. But you also have to keep in mind, when do these players regress? So running back regresses earlier than any other position. 27 years old is when it happens, and it won't happen for every player. And here we have a player who ended up gaining superstar dev. So he missed a year of regression after getting 1,200 yards and 13 touchdowns. That's a pretty good 5th or 6th season in the NFL for another successful second-round running back. And you're seeing a lot of these players, 25, 26 years old. That means when you're in year 3 or 4 of your franchise, you're going to see the opposition have players they've developed that are actually true stars, and it doesn't take them forever. By the time they hit free agency for the first time, they have a chance to sign the big contract like you see in the NFL. That was another big motivator here, making this set. Let's go to wide receiver now, and the best we have here, we have 2 99s. Now, 99s are pretty rare from the simulating that I've done. So, what has Angelo Coakley done, especially at Star Dev? I've been critical of Star Dev players in my testing because I didn't want them getting to be too high overall. What did Angelo Coakley do? So in this case, Coakley was the number 6 overall pick in a draft. Now, his production to me does not say that he should be a 99 overall. Sometimes you'll have these situations play out where a guy has just a really high overall, really high development, and he ends up being like a 99 or a high rating. In this case, that's not my favorite situation that's played out. But clearly, the league is not full of these 99 overall players, so that is, I would say, more of kind of an anomaly. Here we have Mike Hardesty, who also got to be 99, and he's an X factor. Now, he's actually put up the numbers that you would expect of a 99 overall. He began his career as the number 2 pick, and his resume is a lot stronger. So, I honestly can't tell you why the other player reached 99. Some players will slip through the cracks, and maybe they get a little bit higher than they should, but a lot of it depends on what their overall was right away. There's a chance Coakley had X Factor when he was drafted and he's lost 2 developments over the course of his career. I really don't know. Here we got Justin Jefferson, still one of the best. Jonathan Carvey. So we're deep into the future and we're seeing that it's a very, very different league. Now, we're going to keep going through positions here, but I want to switch to a different file. So that file was a lot deeper into the future. Let's do this one that's in 2029. So this would be year 7 of a franchise. This time around, now we're seeing that most of the best quarterbacks were from the base roster, and sometimes that's just going to be the case. A lot of what happens in your league is going to depend on what kind of draft classes you get. And that's ultimately what I think should happen. At running back, it's Bijan again. Kenneth Walker ends up doing pretty good. Isaiah Pacheco ends up simulating really well in a lot of cases. Not as good here because that Chiefs offense is ridiculous. I want to check on Carl Carter here. He's a 24-year-old, 97 overall running back. So he's an X factor. I'm guessing he was probably a very early pick that got kind of the fast track here. And he was the number 2. So you'll see generational players do not take long to end up reaching that high level. At wide receiver on this file, now we're not seeing anyone that was drafted pop up to be that 99 overall. You'll get very different results every time you do this. In this case, we've got a player in his second year who's a true 89 overall, Alfonso Craig, who had a good rookie season, not an elite one, but probably, was number 1 pick, probably a generational overall, 1 rookie of the year. Let's move on now to tight end. This is a weird one sometimes because you're not guaranteed to get a lot of elite tight end prospects. And most of the time, this is what my sims look like. Kyle Pitts at the top, maybe a couple other guys like Michael Mayer ended up developing really well, but occasionally you will get these superstar tight ends that end up producing. Here we've got Markel DiCarvalho, who put together a couple 1,000-yard campaigns, one that is close. Now, I've seen a lot of these tight ends with X Factor or even Superstar not quite reach this level, because in a lot of offenses, they're only going to get like 500 yards a year. And at that level, you're just not going to get to the 90s. So for Colton Green, I'm guessing he had more mid-level production, and that's exactly what we're seeing here. But still established as a solid up-and-coming tight end at just 24 years old. We go to offensive line, and now this is one that is also very tricky because on the base roster for Madden, offensive linemen really don't end up being all that great. In the entire game, there are only 29 tackles on the base roster above an 80 overall, and that's at left and right tackle. That's not enough for every team to even have 1. So if you wanted to drop your draft class strength to weak and end up with certain classes that only produce like a 4th rounder and 3 6th rounders from time to time, that is an option. I would say that my offensive line development is definitely a lot more than the base roster, but you're not going to see every position produce like 32 guys who are 80 overall plus. Tackle is a lot stronger than guard when it comes to the draft classes. So you'll end up seeing some breakout tackles more often than you see the guards. But they'll pop up from time to time, and when they have the proper development, they can become true stars. So here's Jason Tuck, last pick in the 1st round. He's a Pro Bowler, and he's one of the best developers on this file along the offensive line. I played around a bit with the draft class strength sliders, but ultimately I still felt like if you brought them down to weak, things got too weak. If you put a lot of them at strong, things got too strong. So you got to pick, do you want like a really weak offensive line league or one that's a little bit inflated but not over the top? And that's the route I end up taking. Now we move on to the defense, and this is a fun one because production is really not guaranteed. You don't always know who's going to get 15 sack seasons and who's going to end up just getting like 4 or 5. So development here varies a lot. And I found a lot of really cool success stories for players that are drafted in these sims. Here's Jeff Gilmore, who's a 90. Looks like he is an X Factor. So I'm guessing he had some decent seasons, maybe not elite. Had a 10 sack season as a rookie, 7 the next year. So yeah, established quickly as a high-level defensive tackle, Pro Bowler, Rookie of the Year as a 3rd round pick. Outside linebacker looks a little weak, but that's kind of the way the base roster is. On the base roster, there are 4 outside linebackers in the entire game above a 90, and only like 25 are even above an 80. So this is not a spot where you're expecting to see a ton of high 99 overalls necessarily, but if your league produces the stars, then they'll turn into them. Inside linebacker, a lot of times I see one or two guys really pop that was drafted. So here's Tony Wolf, who's now 27, superstar X Factor at linebacker. And, yep, 100 tackle guy, can get interceptions, had 6 this one year. I've had a lot of fun just going through my sims and then seeing, all right, who are the highest players now and what exactly got them here. All right, let's talk defensive back now. So, you'll notice on my sheet, there is one position I've actually edited the draft class strength for, and that is at corner. This was the hardest position to balance. While I didn't need, like, my league to fully emulate, like, what the base roster had for the game, which was 41 corners, 80 overall or higher, I sure wanted to be in that neighborhood. And when I was doing this with like normal draft class strength, I was regularly getting 60 to 70 or more cornerbacks who were 80 overall plus. In this case, we got 52. We're a little bit higher. I'm okay with that. But I've found that cornerback set to weak is actually very balanced, and you're still going to end up getting really good first-round talents and a number of starter caliber in every single draft. You do not want a franchise where there's like 70 corners above an 80. That's enough for each team to have 2. It gets trivial then to even draft a cornerback in the first round. Why would you draft a guy who's going to be the 80th best player at his position in the first round? Doesn't make any sense. I found that on weak, with this development, it's actually extremely balanced, and I've still found a lot of success stories at corner. Safety. You will not always see 90 plus overall players when you simulate to the future because Madden's classes don't produce a lot of elite safety prospects. And even when they do, they don't always produce at an elite level. So in this case, we have a superstar safety who's only got 1 career INT. He does rack up tackles, but he's gotten here based off a pretty high overall and a pretty high development. Now here is something I recorded yesterday from one of my tests. I've been paying attention to the safety spot. I noticed that the Eagles had drafted 2 safeties in this run that were both really, really good. Here's the free safety, Jason Belton, who had, a pretty standard resume, I would say, for a high-level safety. But then at strong safety, Chris Bolden became the best safety in the league at 24 years old. And he did this in just a couple years. He led the league in interceptions in his second season, had 11 picks in his first 3 years. He was the best DB award winner, a Pro Bowler. And that is how 24-year-olds can quickly become the best players at their position here with these settings. You're just not guaranteed that a player is going to do that in a 6-year window. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. I wanted to create sliders where if the right talent shows up and produces, they are rewarded for it. But I'm not trying to just boost everybody for the sake of having high overalls. I wanted development to mostly make sense, and I think there are some players here that, if I could manually rate them, maybe they'd be lower. But sometimes they come in with a high overall and high development, and they're just going to end up being pretty good even with average production. So, that's going to happen. Let's load up a new test file here and see what this league looks like, and this one was a full 10-year simulation. 10-year sims were used for a lot of what I've done, but this is not optimized necessarily for 10 years. Like, I wanted you to be able to see by year 3, new stars are already popping up, and teams aren't just older versions of what they began with. So here we've got, 2 elite running backs in this franchise. The other classes didn't really give us this. Here's a 25-year-old running back who's 99. What did he do? Well, 1,300, 1,400, 1,400 yards. That's elite production. A lot of touchdowns in there. He was originally the number 7 pick, 3 Pro Bowls. So probably one of those like Saquon, Bijan level prospects. And he got the production to actually take him to 99. Sometimes those players just produce middling production and they cap out maybe at like a 90 or so. In this league, we end up with no 90 overall tight ends. You know, if the talent shows up and they produce, they'll eventually get there. Here's James Keller. His production, wasn't quite elite for long enough, so he's only at like a 90 right now. Still, if we continued this, maybe he gets into the mid-90s, but, not quite yet. Most tight ends in this game are going to catch between 600 and 700 yards. See, we can have some high-level offensive linemen. So we're 10 years into the future, and here's a guy who was in this sim for majority of the time, Brandon Scott, who is truly a 95 overall. And he's gotten to be this high with only superstar development and not even X Factor as a second-round pick, 5-time Pro Bowler. I love that. And the thing to remember, too, like, offensive line is not a star-driven position. Like, there are obviously elite players we can all name. Trent Williams, Quentin Nelson, those guys. But much of the league starters, they're just solid, decent players, They get beat by good pass rushers. They shut down bad pass rushers. They're solid, well-paid, but they're not all great. And on the base roster for this game, across the entire offensive line landscape, there are only 14 players rated above a 90. So you'll probably see even less than that using these settings, but if you had higher XP sliders for O-line, then you start getting to a point where, like, every team can have an 80 overall center and right guard and 2 tackles, and that to me just gets kind of boring. I want the league to promote playing young players. I want teams to continue having to search to fill certain holes, and I don't want to see position groups get out of hand. Here was a 10-year sim. How many quarterbacks do we have here in the 80 overall range? Typically, it's like 25 or so. So the 79 overall quarterback is 29 overall, or 29 ranked. So you're still seeing, a few teams do not have established franchise quarterbacks. You got some teams here who have older quarterbacks and probably would still be in the market. So, maybe it's too many quarterbacks who break out, but I'll take this over too few. If I can't get as realistic as I like, my tiebreaker tends to be what makes the league more competitive. And that to me is more teams having good quarterbacks when I play against them. Let's check out this quarterback, by the way. How'd he get to 98? Colin Durbin, 27 years old. 30 touchdowns as a rookie, quickly producing at a pretty high level after being a number 1 overall pick. Here is a completely different file in the year 2029. We got 8 players here who are truly a 99 overall, and at the very top, we got Jamie McMichael, a 26-year-old defensive tackle. What did Jamie do here to become one of the best players in the league in just, 5 years or so? Well, 13 sacks as a rookie, and consistently producing sacks throughout the next handful of years in those critical years for development. Ends up getting a monster contract, 3 Pro Bowls, already a strong resume, and he's only 26 years old. Here we go. We got a tight end who broke out in this simulation. John Bacon. Superstar dev. His true overall is 90, and he's 27 years old. And decent production, nothing too special. But this is just a case where, you don't often get these superstar tight ends. When they do show up, they will become the stars of your league. I'm telling you, they will. It's just how often they show up. What if we go strong draft class on that setting? Well, you're just going to end up with a few too many good tight ends, I'd say, overall. On the base roster, there's only 18 who are above an 80, so it's not really meant to be the strongest position, and I like the balance overall that this slider set gives. Here we got, the number 22 ranked tight end is a 79, so half the league has one, half the league doesn't. I'm going to run one more test right here, and I just want to go like 3 years into the future, and let's see how things can possibly look just after a few short years in franchise. While we wait for this to simulate, we can talk about some of the settings that I have on here. So, staff talent modifier, that is set to slower, because This is actually going to play a pretty big role now in your development because those coaching trees, which they've made better this year, they're going to offer experience boost to a variety of positions. Now, in my tests, I had set that to slower because in general, I think you end up getting those talents a little too quickly, and you can max out a coaching tree, I think, too soon. So in this case, it slows it down a little bit, and it's what I used along the way here in my testing, and I like the results that I had. Progressive fatigue is set to off because I don't like its implementation in Madden. I originally was very excited for it, but it is not a true wear and tear system, and the CPU doesn't know really what to do with it, and you just end up having players disappear from games. It doesn't actually accomplish anything necessary. Dev trait regression is set to on, so that you have players who are X factors, eventually lose it, and new players become the X factors of your league. Now, my desired players at all the developments are actually just the default EA had. I used default settings running my tests. I never felt the need to change it. The positions got to where I wanted them. The stars showed up, produced at a high level. I just didn't see any need to mess with this. And then draft class strength is set to weak for cornerbacks, and that's the only one that I would mess with. At normal, I think you just end up with a very deep cornerback position throughout your league every single time, whereas on weak, I have still seen, generational players, a lot of first-rounders, and plenty of players who are above 70 overall with starting futures. But in general, I think that weak cornerback classes give you the most balance. And now, if there's something here you don't like, then, you can change whatever you want. Ultimately, what I'm doing here is not meant to be, the right answer. It's my interpretation and what I'm looking for from Madden and my experience in franchise, the way I want players to develop. If you see things differently, then you can go ahead and change whatever it is that you like. For my regression sliders, the highest positions are at wide receiver, running back, and quarterback. So they're high at running back because in the NFL, you see, it's a young man's position, basically. Rookie contracts. No one wants 28-year-old running backs these days. So we regress them stronger than any other spot. And you do see a lot of those guys, have very short careers these days. We just had a number of big contracts, handed out to guys like Le'Veon Bell, Todd Gurley, David Johnson, and none of those even came close to actually returning value. Wide receiver I have set to 170 because that's another very athleticism-based spot. And in general, there tends to be a lot of big stars at the position. And if you don't regress them quickly, they end up all just playing forever. And this way, there's a little more variance, but you're still going to see the best of the best play into their 30s. At quarterback, 140. Quarterbacks should not begin to regress in this game until they're 31 years old. So 140, I feel, is a pretty good spot where we saw here in some of my tests. Like, a lot of them end up being high-quality starters for a number of years, and others are still good starters, but maybe closer to like an 88 overall and not 99. If you look at the base roster, the best quarterbacks are under 30. If you look at guys who have been around for a while, like Aaron Rodgers, he was an 88, I think, on the base roster. He's not at the top of his game there. The other thing I thought was important here with this set was I wanted, similar positions or positions that develop similarly to have uniform progression. So cornerback, safeties, they're all at 84 progression. There's no reason for those to be any different. They all gain XP the same way. Tackles, interceptions, pass breakups. So the only reason you're going to see, more good corners than safeties is because your draft produced way more good corners than safeties, which is just the way it is. Offensive line, there's no reason for those to be any different. They all develop the same exact way, which is snaps. They have very few ways to get better. And your classes will produce more good tackles than guards. It's just the way it is. And I think in the NFL, you see a lot more star tackles than you do star guards. Receivers and tight ends have the same progression because they're just pass catchers primarily, and there wasn't any reason for that to be different in my testing. Tight end regression only being 110. So I felt like it was a position that relies less on elite athleticism, and a lot of tight ends stick around and have long careers. So I was okay with that regression not being as aggressive. And then again, running back being 100, they have a small window to progress, and ultimately we want running back to be a position where players are producing a lot in their first, second, third years of their careers. So we want them to develop quickly because they're going to start regressing at age 27. And that regression is going to hit really hard. And I love the results I've had going through and just seeing what things look like at the running back position, even just a few years into the future. And then just to explain my age sliders a little bit, so I did try going higher than 120 in some cases, but I just felt like it was boosting players too much that didn't quite deserve the ratings they were getting. I felt 120 was my sweet spot given this set. And I have 120 for 20 through 24 years old, which guarantees that rookies you draft will have at least 1 year at that 120%. I did not include 25 years old, although I consider that to be a development year, because I felt like there's no rookies in Madden outside of like Velus Jones last year, but like in the draft classes, rookies are usually from 21 to 24 years old. I wanted that to kind of be a little bit separate tier, and then 25 is a notch lower, 26 a notch lower than that, and it progressively drops so that, even players at 27 are not developing at the same rate they would at default. Because I think by 27, most players are done developing, and you kind of are who you are. Are there exceptions? Yes, but if we try to allow every edge case to be replicated, we're not going to have a solution here. And then eventually, it just keeps progressively getting lower. And the only reason I have any progression there for players in the 30s is just so the elite performers have a way to combat regression. If you're gaining enough XP to overpower that regression on these sliders, then you probably earned it by winning an MVP or winning some awards. I think that here they're barely going to develop anyway. And then age regression, I just didn't explore that a whole lot. I like to handle regression more on the position level, and I felt like I was getting pretty good results doing that. So I didn't mess much with age regression on top of it. And my process for getting to this point, I didn't talk about this a whole lot, but I started out going position by position 1 year at a time, looking at just how certain players were developing. I looked at certain star dev players, superstar dev players, and I used that to tweak the position values. And then I began to do more multi-year sims when I liked the levels that I was at. And that's when I would do, I'd leave the room for a while, and I'd just let a 10-year sim run. Or I'd be editing a video on my computer, and I'd let a 10-year sim run. I'd look over and see it's, 7 years in the future, and just stop it and take a look. And I did that, for the better part of the last couple weeks as I got into more of the deep simulating. And that's how I got here. When I would make changes, by the way, I'm someone who I like to make changes very slowly. So if I felt 80 XP, 80% was too much, then I'd be trying like 76 or 74. Like I go very gradually and not overcorrect, because in my head it feels good that I'm always getting closer, even if I'm not quite getting there. It feels good that every tick, if this is too much, if I go one tick in the other direction, I'm getting closer to my solution. So I like to go slowly there. So I've actually, a lot of these sliders have been locked in for a while, and I've gotten to see like an incredible sample of seasons and runs on these settings. All right, so we've simulated to the 2026 preseason. A few years have passed. Let's take a look at how things can look after just a couple years. What developments are happening here in this league? It can be a little early to see certain positions be dominated by new players, so I'm expecting to see, mostly the base roster, but where do the other players begin to show up? So no drafted quarterbacks here, unfortunately, above an 82 overall in this run, which tells you there wasn't anybody generational in those three classes because they typically began about 81, 82 overall. So in this run, one thing I like to see is after a few years, we've now had 6 teams draft a brand new running back starter. So, depending on the strength of your classes, you'll see that happen, a lot more or a lot less. But typically I'm seeing, 2 or 3 new starters a year are kind of popping up across the league. Probably more so as you get deeper and a lot of the base roster stars are kind of regressed out of the league a little bit. But here we got Sidney McElroy, one of the up-and-coming players in this sim. We got a few wide receivers here who are popping in the low 80s, nothing higher than that at this point. So it's only been a couple of years, so it's not a lot of time for them to develop. And in this case here, we got a star dev player, so we're not expecting him to be the highest rated player at all. He has 2 years experience. All right, I've gone one more year into the future because in a 2026 sim, you've only gotten 2 years of drafted development on one class primarily. So if we check out the league after just one more year, starting to see kind of the next star quarterbacks take hold here in the league. We've got Leslie Whitfield, the running back of the Ravens, quickly becoming close to a top 10 running back. Now, on the base roster, there are only 9 centers who are above an 80 overall, and we've got a drafted player here already becoming a top 5. Yes, 83 is not high, but center's not like a high-rated position to begin with. 11th best defensive tackle is already someone who was drafted a few years ago with star development. Not seeing like a ton of like superstars come out of this little 4-year run. Some will produce those players, some won't, but it really depends on the draft class luck and if anyone ends up really popping in a big way there. Still got plenty of good like mid-80s players and players who are a couple years away maybe from being among the best at the positions. So you begin to see how the league is shifting, and at first it might seem a little slow, but in a lot of my sims you can see by the time you're 6-7 years in, the league changes quite a bit. And I think that's going to about wrap this one up. I hope that those of you that try out the set enjoy it. I think that it'll be, good for whatever league you want to do. I think that this progression that I've put together here will allow you to develop superstars, but not have a league that's just too full of them. I think you'll see a lot of really cool success stories. Here's one clip I saved during one of my sims where we see that the best running backs, are all 29 or under, and you've got 24, 23, 25-year-old running backs who are in the top 10 in the league. So I hope that everybody has a good time with this. I had fun putting it together, and I feel like now I can have my franchises unfold in a way they really aren't accustomed to. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and leave your feedback down below. Would love to know what you all think. Have a great day. And I guess I have a franchise that I gotta get to next. See you later.